Hey gang, welcome to this economic update. Today is January 7th, 2019. Happy New Year. My name is Dennis Tubbergen. Today I want to talk to you a bit about central banks and socialistic political rhetoric. And I don't mean to insinuate that the two are related because they're not, but in my view, there are a couple things that really threaten our economic well-being. I happen to believe, as Ron Paul, former presidential candidate, that central banks are the problem. The Central Bank of the United States is the Federal Reserve Bank, and contrary to what some people mistakenly believe, the Federal Reserve is a group of private bankers. Back in 1913, then President Woodrow Wilson and Congress saw fit to give control of monetary policy to private bankers. Now, why do I say that central banks are the problem? Well, they enable politicians to spend money and expand debt levels to, frankly, just indefensible levels. Now, a good example of this is what's going on in Venezuela, where the policy response to excessive debt levels and monster deficits has been money printing. And frankly, we've seen a lot of money printing here. Since the financial crisis, the Fed has printed via quantitative easing, Operation Twist, whatever program name you want to call it, whatever sanitized term you want to use for money printing, it means money printing. Now, Venezuela was once one of Latin America's richest countries. The country is oil rich, but at one time it also produced more than enough food to feed the population of Venezuela with enough left over to export food in addition to oil. Now, all that has changed. The picture on the screen is a recent picture from protests in Venezuela because the situation there is, in a word, horrendous. Each day, desperate Venezuelans pour over the border into neighboring Colombia to try to find some hope. Women arriving in Colombia opt to sell their hair to local wig makers for $10 to $30. The amount they receive depends on the length and quality of the hair. Other Venezuelan women sell their bodies, and both men and women crossing the Colombian border are exposed to sex trafficking. Venezuelan teenagers now hawk cigarettes, sweets, and water on the streets of Colombia for small change. Venezuelan inflation is staggering. Venezuela's National Assembly states the inflation rate in Venezuela rose to 1,300% in November. Now just think about that for a minute. Think about what you can buy today for $1. And then imagine that New Year's Day of 2020, you'll spend $1,300,000 for the same item. That rivals the infamous Weimar Republic's hyperinflation after World War I. Now, this hyperinflation has come about simply because of money printing. Venezuelan leadership had three choices to continue to finance the massive level of government programs after Hugo Chavez took power. They could raise taxes, they could cut the programs, or they could print money. Well, like usually happens, the politicians chose the latter. Massive money printing as a result of underfunded government always, eventually, inevitably leads to economic disarray, and Venezuela has been no exception to this economic truth. So how did Venezuela end up here anyway? How did the government get to the point that money printing seemed like the only possible politically acceptable solution? Vernon Smith, who is a Nobel laureate in economics, recently commentated. He said, "The government of Venezuela, in the name of the people and for the benefit of the people, seized the big, bad, profit-grabbing oil companies, thinking that anyone off the street could run a business. They started redistributing wealth to the poor, made electricity free. They were praised by some, well, at least one American Nobel economist for reducing inequality. This small, incredibly rich country now cannot feed itself. Markets whose prices coordinate and incentivize the creation of wealth cannot function. Farmers cannot buy seed or fertilizer rather. Food imports have declined 70%, and people cannot find enough food in the garbage cans. The invisible to the eye workings of the complex economy of plenty, which of course cannot assure that all will be productive enough to share in its plenty, has utterly collapsed. Reverse all these policies and its effects would immediately be reversed and plenty restored as quickly as it disappeared. Now, historically speaking, when inflation begins in earnest, governments also impose price controls. Following this oft-repeated historical script, the Venezuelan government implemented price controls which set a maximum price for which an item can be sold. History also teaches us that price controls never work. Venezuela has just proven the point again. The reason price controls don't work is simple. When the cost to manufacture or produce an item exceeds the price for which the item can be sold, manufacturers quit manufacturing and producers quit producing. That's also the problem with excessive tax and intense government regulation. As soon as it's unprofitable to produce something or more trouble than it's worth to produce something, producers become less likely to produce. Yet despite that, time and time again throughout history, it's been well established that governments can't efficiently run a business. Governments cannot efficiently run a business. And that an extreme government interference in markets leads to extremely detrimental results. But there are still politicians out there that would like the populace to believe otherwise. The Foundation for Economic Education, one of my favorite nonprofit organizations, published an op-ed article written by Barry Brownstein, who remarked, "Given that the Venezuelan tragedy is man-made, it's hard to fathom why politicians such as Jeremy Corbyn, pictured on the left, who could be the next Prime Minister of the UK, and Bernie Sanders are not laughed out of politics." Corbyn has also supported Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro supported Sanders in 2016, calling him a revolutionary friend. In 2011, ignoring food shortages, this is what Bernie Sanders said. "These days, the American dream is more apt to be realized in South America, in places such as Ecuador, Venezuela, and Argentina." In 2013, Jeremy Corbyn said this, "We salute Chavez and the people of Venezuela for turning the clock of history full circle. I look forward to the development of Venezuela, the efficiency of Venezuela in providing good services and decency for all the people of that country." Sadly, many yet share the delusion that central planning is possible. A survey by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation found that 6 out of every 10 Americans surveyed were wholly unfamiliar with Venezuela's socialist dictator, Maduro. Well, with this level of ignorance, it's no wonder more millennials would prefer to live in a socialist country than a capitalist one, and the count is 44% to 42%. So, how did Venezuelans get here? Well, 20 years ago last month, Hugo Chavez won a landslide victory, catapulting him to power. Once in power, Chavez was nonstop action. He nationalized countries by the dozen, imposed controls on currency transactions, and set limits on the interest rates and prices business could charge. There's price controls again. He purged the upper ranks of the state-run oil giant, the untouchable goose that laid the golden egg, and then had the company divert precious resources away from the energy fields and into socialist-style manufacturing co-ops. He became the international darling of the leftist movement, shipping subsidized fuel to Nicaragua and Cuba, giving heating oil away to the poor in the Bronx, signing joint ventures with Iran and Russia, financing Argentina after its default, and even hobnobbing with Sean Penn, Oliver Stone, and Michael Moore. And of course, he drafted a new constitution, giving birth to the Fifth Republic, which allowed him to seek re-election indefinitely. Now here are some facts. The U.S.'s massive debt levels cannot be paid. Public sector debt levels cannot be paid. So we need to beware of political rhetoric and central bank interference that threaten and are threatening our economic well-being. Now, I look at things politically from a libertarian capitalist perspective, which means I am not a member of a political party, but rhetoric like this is downright scary. The recently elected Representative Cortez drew attention for suggesting the wealthiest Americans ought to pay a marginal tax rate as high as 70% in order to fund a Green New Deal. I repeat what I said earlier. When you take away the profit incentive, when you make it impossible, when you make it uncomfortable to make a profit, producers quit producing and manufacturers quit manufacturing. The economy is already slowing down, and imposing tax rates as high as 70% on any taxpayer is sure to be the final nail in the coffin. Steve Jobs had it right. He said people need to have the incentive that if they invest and succeed, they can make a fair profit. I would paraphrase that to say they can keep a fair profit. Otherwise, they'll stop investing. That's this week's Economic Update.